Great. Thank you, Susan. And it's good to be joining you, if remotely. I am indeed Vice President for Research, but in a previous life I used to do a lot of ecology, and I want to talk today about sustainable ecological approaches to some of the challenges to food production. I'm going to focus particularly on biotic challenges, particularly insect outbreaks, but I also want to talk a little bit about drought, and one challenge that we haven't heard too much about today so far, and that's salt stress. So the issue with challenges, abiotic stresses in particular, is that they rarely occur in isolation. And the projects that I've been involved with in the Mekong, farmers are struggling with both drought but also saltwater intrusion. And we've already heard about the impacts of extreme weather on farming production, whether that's crop or livestock, droughts and floods. We have a pub in the village where I live called the Jolly Farmer. Not often, in my experience. It's either too wet or too dry, mostly for farmers. So they're battling these sorts of conditions. And also, of course, there are a lot of pest problems, and that's often linked to climate. We're currently facing one of the worst outbreaks of locusts in recent times, thought to be linked to climate change, and very difficult to control because a lot of the issues around pests occur in regions of the world where food security is already a challenge, and there's limited resilience in terms of food stocks or capacity to deal with these issues. And we've spent a lot of time today already thinking about the increased demands on our agricultural and food system, increased demands for energy, for food, for water, and all those demands to be met with in the face of climate change. And I guess agriculture is at the center of that kind of perfect storm of challenges. But I think we've also heard a lot today about the importance of thinking of the whole system, and particularly the social and human aspects of farming. And I think Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the UN, of course, he I think summarized it very nicely. We need to connect the dots between climate, poverty, energy, food and water. We can't consider these things in isolation. And the FAO put together what I thought was an interesting approach here, 5 principles of sustainable food and agriculture. And they viewed agriculture as being kind of at the transition between the natural system and the human system. A natural system where environmental services and natural resources were important, but also linked very much to economic and social well-being. And the principles they identified were improving efficiency in the use of resources, and we've just heard a very nice talk about how AI can help that, conserve and protect and enhance natural resources, but also they were keen that we didn't forget about rural livelihoods, the resilience of people, communities and ecosystems, and also effective governance. We've heard a little bit about policy today, but how those policies can be driven forward depends on that wider picture. So sustainable intensification was one of the themes of this session, and there's been a lot of interest in sustainable intensification, and David started the day right away by talking about the confusion around that term, but it certainly appeared in an awful lot of publications over the years, but other terms have started to emerge, and you're probably thinking the last thing we need is more confusion over terms, but the reason I mention ecological intensification and agroecological intensification is because I think they make an important point that if we're going to improve our production and reduce environmental impacts, we need to think about ecological processes and ecosystem services, which we have talked quite a lot about, and also think about the wider social cultural perspective and farmers' knowledge and farmer behaviour, which we've talked rather less about, but I think is just as important. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about is sustainable crop protection. And at the moment, most of our pest control is certainly not sustainable. We lose a lot of our crops to pests, weeds, and diseases. And current crop protection you could regard as a success. It's preventing the loss of around 20 to 40% of production. We certainly see big reductions in losses compared to the potential for losses without those controls. But we're losing a lot of the bioactives because of their non-target effects and because they're losing efficacy as pests and diseases become resistant. But if we can make an impact on these losses, we can certainly improve food security in areas of the world where it's certainly challenged. But we haven't done ourselves any favours because we've selected in our crop breeding systems for the traits that we most desire, increasing yield and increasing grain production. But that has led to some very significant changes in terms of how our crops are protected. So here you can see wild potatoes, and here you can see supermarket potatoes. Unsurprisingly, we prefer these, but so do pests. And of course, we make up the difference there with artificial chemicals. So I want to talk about potential solutions, talk to us about problems so far. And one thing that could be an encouragement to us is that although we've talked a lot about fruit and vegetables, in actual fact we mostly eat grass. So about 40% of the world's calorie intake is really three grasses, maize, rice and wheat. And we have, of course, severely modified those plants, but at heart they are grasses. We eat them and our livestock eat them, and they are defended. They are not without anti-herbivore mechanisms, principally, of course, silicon. And that's taken up from the soil in solution through the transpiration stream and some active mechanisms, and it's deposited as these phytoliths in spines and hairs on the surface and in modified silica cells. And it can have quite a severe impact on on herbivores. This is Spodoptera, an armyworm, a very severe pest, and eating a silica-rich plant is rather like those lovely beach excursions you had as a kid, and dropped your sandwich in the sand. And it's this, I guess, is exactly the reaction of insects when they face high levels of silicon, and we can see that. Here, this is the mandibles of Spodoptera fed on a low silica diet. That's the great thing about working on insects. You know, you can rear them on a plant and then just chop their heads off and look at their jaws and nobody worries. And you can see that the mandibles are fairly intact here, but when they've been feeding for a relatively short period of time, this can happen in 48 hours, the mandibles are very much worn down by the silicon, and that has a very severe impact on their performance. So this is a meta-analysis of a large number of studies on the impact of silicon on chewing herbivores and on phloem feeders. Much worse impact of silicon on the performance of chewing herbivores, but you can see even for aphids and so on, there are negative effects. So you're probably thinking, well, hang on a second, I thought we've disarmed our plants through domestication. Well, we kind of haven't when it comes to silicon, and in a recent study with colleagues at Sheffield, we looked at wild species, early domesticates and modern varieties of a number of different crops, and the wild progenitor is here in grey, and landrace in green, modern cultivars in orange, and you can see that across the species as a whole, there's been very little loss of silica defences, and there's been some changes. This is barley, although even modern barley is very well defended. So just as well we don't eat the leaves, I reckon. So there are generally silicon defences have remained. And that's led to a lot of excitement and enthusiasm from some quarters about the role of silicon in agriculture. There's been volumes published on it, and I particularly like the ambitious title of this first study, Establishing Broad-Spectrum Disease Resistance, Silicon Leads the Way. And recently there's been papers around it being a so-called silver bullet for mitigating stresses. But if we're going to understand whether this is actually true, I think there are two key questions for us. Firstly, we need to understand what are the genotypic physiological environmental processes that govern silicon uptake in agricultural systems. And then we also need to do what's been mentioned several times today, and I think is exactly right, which is to integrate our kind of crop breeding and genetic approaches with agronomy, with practical advice for farmers. So can we exploit variation in silicon uptake for practical benefits in the field? Well, the good news is that there's certainly a lot of genetic variation in silicon uptake in our crops. So this is a collection of 15 wheat cultivars, and they've been grown hydroponically in exactly the same concentration of silicon in the media, but you can see that the actual level of silicon varies quite substantially. This is a rice diversity panel developed in Vietnam, and again you can see a very large difference in the uptake of silicon when grown in identical conditions. So this work has been done with Franz Matthias at York, and he's very keen, despite my best efforts to get him interested in herbivores, his big interest is salt and drought tolerance. And he noticed with his 15 wheat cultivars that the ones that had the highest levels of silicon uptake were the ones whose growth was least inhibited when they were put under drought stress. So silicon was a protector against the growth decrease you saw in drought conditions. And he also saw that silicon concentrations were positively correlated with the potassium levels in the shoot and negatively correlated under salt stress with the sodium levels. So there's quite a lot of evidence in the literature now to show that silicon tends to block the uptake of sodium into the cells and promotes the uptake of potassium. And that is very important for mitigating the damage that cells suffer under salt stress. So this has led to a much larger project, which would not have been possible without Susan's fantastic rice diversity panel, which she very generously shared with Franz several years ago now. And we've teamed up with IRI as well, and they have some more rice lines. And there's been a large program of testing these different rice lines for drought tolerance in rain-out shelters, for salt tolerance in hydroponic systems, to try and identify lines that are resistant to those two stresses, and even to try and then, through cross-breeding program, try and create elite cultivars that are resistant to both those stresses. Now, the genetic part of the program is still ongoing. There have been some promising developments, and one thing that has been found already is some lines that are good donors for salinity. These are lines that are salt tolerant. There are some lines that are drought tolerant, and these are being crossed into these recipient parents. And my interest, of course, in this project is to see whether silicon is of benefit as well in these genotypes. And the first thing that we looked at was the effect of salt stress on the silicon levels in the plants, and the levels of silicon in both the root and the shoot vary quite a lot between the different lines. But one thing that is very clear, that in both root and shoot, increasing salt levels leads to an increase in the uptake of silicon. So here are our our salt-tolerant lines, CSR28 and FL478. Here's a more high-yielding elite cultivar, and this is one of our drought-tolerant lines. And they've been grown in 3 levels of salt stress, none, 50 and 80, same concentrations as here, and in a range of silicon concentrations. And the thing you can see here is, firstly, of course, our salt-tolerant lines do a lot better under salt stress than our non-salt tolerant lines. You heard it here first. But the other thing that's very noticeable is that silicon protects the lines against salt stress. So this line here, when it's growing without silicon, cannot grow at all in the 2 higher levels of salt. But when it's provided with silicon, it certainly can. So silicon can rescue all 4 lines from the impacts of salt stress, but it does that much more effectively in the lines that aren't tolerant, in the elite cultivars. They're protected even more. So then we wanted to know whether tolerance to drought and salinity correlated with silicon uptake in our panel genotypes. Well, no, not really. There wasn't a very close relationship between the ability of a genotype to take up silicon and its tolerance to either drought or salinity. It was clear that silicon addition increased salt tolerance, particularly in sensitive lines, as I've shown you, and it reduces shoots sodium content in all lines by varying amounts, but by up to 60%. So then we did a genome-wide association study for concomitant peaks for silicon accumulation and salt tolerance. There was a little bit of overlap in chromosome 1 that mapped to around 23 genes, not silicon uptake genes, although there were 2 other transporters. And many genes were identified that are linked to cell wall structure and function. And that's something we've found with more intensive GWIs, just focusing on salt tolerance, which found about 29 genes on chromosome 8, one of which was not expressed at all in salt tolerant lines and is a sort of wall-associated kinase. So the genetic work looks to be identifying some interesting traits around cell wall structure. But I want to move on to sort of practical benefits of silicon, and whether, as we've just been hearing in the first talk in this session, whether we can come up with help for farmers that is practical and affordable. And from the work we've done in the lab, we're trialing some field work, because we discovered that in almost all genotypes, you could achieve salt stress mitigation with as little as 0.4 millimolar of silicon. So that could translate to around 22 kilos a hectare of silicon addition. And because silicon is a waste product from many processes and is very abundant, that would be a cheap addition. That could be achieved with a cost of about $3 to $4 a hectare. So if this works, it is a cheap option. And we've been trying with colleagues in Australia the impact of silicon on lucerne, as they call it in Australia, alfalfa everywhere else. And this is using steel furnace slag. They still have steel furnaces in Australia, and calcium silicate is a big component of the slag. You can chuck it onto a field trial and see a big increase in bioavailable silicon. You can see an increase in silicon uptake and an increase in yield. doesn't look to be any detectable adverse effects on soil biota or metal concentrations. And it's particularly interesting because we've shown in other studies that silicon addition tends to increase the rate of root nodulation in these plants. There are various potential mechanisms. We've just got a paper coming out in functional ecology that looks at what those mechanisms might be, but silicon does have benefits for the interactions of crops and their beneficial microbes. It increases root nodulation. It also increases mycorrhizal colonization in many studies. So this is being trialled now on a wider scale for agricultural benefits for yield with reduced environmental impacts. But I want to get off my favourite subject just for a moment. Silicon isn't the only sustainable pest control. We've heard quite a lot about intercropping, co-cropping, the benefits of growing an additional crop within your system, which are multiple. They're certainly not just related to pests. But I wanted to mention the work of a PhD student with myself and Kelly Redeker, who's been doing a meta-analysis on intercropping and looking at its effectiveness against nematodes and soil-borne diseases. And of course, soil pests and soil-borne diseases are a real challenge to farmers. They often don't see the impacts until it's very late in the process and hard to control. So we looked at around 250 experiments on intercropping, 43 different focal crops, 20 different intercrops, 7 different nematodes, 9 different pathogens. And to cut to the chase, soil-borne diseases, the damage to the primary crop was reduced by 54% on average in these intercropping systems, and nematode damage was reduced by 31%. Now, you're probably thinking, well, hang on a second, you've got another crop in there, so you're going to see a reduction in yield. We've heard a lot about trade-offs today already. But the interesting thing is that, well, firstly, a lot of these intercrops are valuable in themselves. We're talking about mustards and onions and various other things that could be sold as well. But even if they aren't, our analysis showed that 51% reduction in damage was sufficient to obtain equivalent yields from intercropping fields compared to a monocrop, even if you didn't take anything from the intercrop. So you can see that on that calculation, intercropping would be cost-effective for soil-borne diseases, not so much for nematodes. Okay, so we've heard a bit today about whether these techniques are being taken up, and if not, why not? And Jules Pretty and Tim Benton and Pete Smith and a cast of thousands, including myself, looked at a global assessment of sustainable intensification and whether these different methods were being taken up. And there is cause for optimism. There's a lot of these different techniques now, push-pull systems we've heard about already today, and low tillage, lots of different ways of making farms more sustainable. And we calculated in this study that around 29% of farms were applying some of these techniques, and that was around 9% of at that time in 2018 of agricultural area. So that tells you one thing that's quite interesting, and that is that these techniques are taken up more by small farmers in the global south than they are by large, intensive industrial farms in the global north. And that's something that we've been hearing a bit about today, and it was a conclusion from Tara Garnett's and Charles Godfrey's paper on sustainable intensification. And I think I've just highlighted a couple of their conclusions here, which I think are really important. There are major opportunities for improving environmental and productivity outputs simultaneously in agricultural systems with low levels of production. They were less convinced in this study that it would work so well in high input production systems because of trade-offs. And we've heard some of those trade-offs today. But I also think that sometimes we think trade-offs exist when they don't. There was an interesting study, which I haven't got time to sort of go into now, but I can share the paper that came out recently looking at pesticide applications in France. and they studied 1,000 farms over 10 years and found that pesticide use could be reduced by 42% with no negative effects on either yield or profit on almost two-thirds of farms. So sometimes I think people worry about trade-offs when they're not actually there. But of course that is another key issue. It's what is your willingness to take risks with these approaches? And another important conclusion from Tara and Charles's work was we might need more scientific knowledge, but we need to know a lot more about different attitudes to the food system, how stakeholders hold different attitudes to it, and they have different values. And we've developed in a project, myself and Richard Gunton and a number of others, a sort of more a framework for trying to understand people's assessment of what matters to them in the environment. We call it a puristic environmental framework. And we've been testing it out with different stakeholders, particularly farmers, trying to understand what solutions appeal and what solutions don't. And I just want to finish by highlighting another paper by this group looking at trying to assess whether sustainable intensification has actually worked. And they've divided it into kind of ecosystem services kind of analysis, provisioning services. So what's happened in the UK is what we've heard about already. Wheat yield here is flat. Livestock tends to be declining. And very interestingly, this dotted orange line, I hope you can see, is self-sufficiency in the UK, which is also declining. And one of the conclusions from this study, and we've heard several people mention it already today, is that the UK is exporting its environmental agricultural problems basically by importing more food. So we've not been very effective within the UK, at least as effective as we might have been. We've tended to sort of reduce production, but also increase imports. But there is some good news. This is pollution from runoff in rivers, the blue line, agricultural emissions, fertilizer use, pesticide use. They're all going down, but production is staying flat. So you could say maybe there is some sustainable intensification. But overall, environmental degradation was not really improving. So recovery of ecological systems has been quite slow. And as we've already heard today, farm incomes might be rising, but costs are rising, and the UK farming sector is still very heavily dependent on subsidies, and it will be interesting to see how the new public money for public goods system plays out. I'm on the board of Natural England, which is the government statutory advisory body for the natural environment in England, and we're responsible for working with DEFRA to try and design and implement such a system. I won't bore you to death with all the legion challenges around that. Certainly farmer training is going to be one, suitable metrics is going to be another, the size of the budget is going to be another. But at least, as I think Giles was saying earlier, it was Andy, wasn't it, that we're at least having a conversation about these things now for the first time in a very long time in the UK. So I'll end on that positive note. We are having a conversation, and we are in a period, I think, of very rapid change in our agroecosystems, whether that's the sort of sensor technology we just heard about to kick this session off, or whether it's other approaches to sustainable pest control and better management of resources, a better understanding of farmer behaviour. But I think we are at a very exciting time, as I think our first speaker said, or certainly an earlier speaker. And I guess I'll just finish with a quote I like very much from this article by Struik and Kuiper. Society needs an agriculture that demonstrates resilience under future change, an agronomy that can cope with the diversity of trade-offs across different stakeholders, and a sustainability that's perceived as a dynamic process based on agreed values, shared knowledge, insight and wisdom. That's easy then. So I shall leave it there and just thank my collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sue. And I think we give you one clarifying question, and then we're going to have a very brief break and come back for the rest of the panel for this section. Is there anybody who wants to ask one question? Not today. Oh, yes, Alison. Sorry.
Yeah, I was, this is Alison Van Inenham from UC Davis. I was curious about the silicon and the lucerne or alfalfa in Australia, because my understanding is from a nutritional perspective in livestock feed that silicon is inversely proportional to digestibility, and yet it appeared it had no impact on the alfalfa, as I understood what you said. Is that correct?
Yes, you're absolutely right in that there's a very strong relationship between silicon content and digestibility, but it does vary between crops. So we found in rice that silicon is the primary determinant of digestibility and forage quality. In rice straw, for example, is one of the reasons that rice straw is so difficult to burn in furnaces and is such poor quality forage. And it's more important than lignin even in that sense. But it doesn't seem to have such a big impact in lucerne, and it may be because of the very different quality that forage has with being so much higher in nitrogen. But I don't think we haven't done any feeding trials like we have with the rice straw, so we don't understand that so well.
Okay, thank you so much, Sue, and I hope your dad's health is improving.
Yeah, he's out of hospital now, still very frail and very confused, but he's much better, thank you.
Yeah, sorry you couldn't make it, but thank you so much for this presentation. We appreciate it. And we'll take a brief break. I think we're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to have to limit it from 15 to maybe 10 minutes. If you could come back as soon as you take a bit of a bio break, we'd appreciate it. Thanks. Bye-bye.